in the mind of a hunter. Jura opened his eyes to a blue light. A lamp that stood randomly emerging from the street ground. Around it were the little people, praying towards it, only their upper body from the waist visible as the rest was sunken within a strange, cloudy phenomena laying over the ground like water. The foot of the lamp was assembled with what looked like scrap metal parts that curved slightly so the lantern-like frame hung by several chains that embraced the entirety of the curved lamp foot. By no fire or candlelight did it produce the calming blue light. Rather, the shone seemed to be emitted out of thin air in a glowing, formless orb. He stood up from his kneeling, awakening pose, and seconds after, more of the hunters also manifested and rose up next to him. He looked around, once more in old Yharnam, from dream to nightmare. The lamp was standing inconveniently in the middle of the street, like it had always been there. But he would have remembered noticing such a peculiar design in such a peculiar location. "The civilians!" he exclaimed, having suddenly remembered the task from earlier that had proven itself not a dream, but reality. "The people we escorted! You remember them, right?" He turned to his companions and, one by one, they too recalled their venture. "They were not in the dream. So, where are they?" one questioned. Jura could not seem to locate the memory that caused them to be removed into a dream. He could only recall them being in the old church with the powder kegs, looking up at the dreadful moon and preparing to set off with the defenseless people. Church. We should make our way back to the old church. That's the last I remember. His memories must have correlated with the rest, as none opposed his proposition, and they set off in its direction. "I don't feel truly awake," one of the hunters remarked while pulling up his face cover. "I don't know what's real. One moment I was in town, then in a dream with no memory of how I got there, and now back into what feels like another dream." "Think not too much of it," another voice behind him answered. "Master Gelmir told so himself. Besides, waking up felt just like going inside the tomb of the gods." The town had changed little since last. The sky was still that of a nightmare, and the air was filled with screams to the underlying tone of fires burning. They had not been walking long until they spotted the unaware beasts beyond, blocking passage. While he was spying for a way around the obstacle, a fully evolved monster, large like a bear, came leaping down from the roofs with a roar that made the yonder beasts' heads turn. "Partner up!" Jura yelled as he unholstered his new blunderbuss, fresh from the dream workshop. "Pick them off! Kimberly, with me!" The furred wretches were large and had long since shed the clothes that they once owned. variants from creatures in the shapes of large wolves to deformed half-men with tufts of fur and irregular growths with crooked and deformed limbs. He retracted the stake to have it ready for thrust. Kimberly shot around to get their attention. The group of hunters formed a wide arc across the broad street, so as to scatter them out and separate their prey. One of them advanced towards Kimberly, and Jura delivered a salvo of shrapnel from his own firearm while darting closer towards its side, which successfully provoked it into a mindless charge. Jura allowed his partner to slice it with her saw cleaver before he could confidently jab with his stake into the beast's side. It slumped down, but he had not the chance to make sure it was entirely dead, for he saw a looming, thrashing beast come upon Kimberly from behind, out of nowhere. It assaulted her and brought her to the ground onto her stomach, biting and clawing with bloodthirsty frenzy into her back while she screamed out in pain. He jumped over the fallen carcass and swiped at the head of the assailant with his broad blade and thrusting it down the back of its neck. But despite his attacks, it ignored him, continuing to maniacally reave through the body below it until it succumbed to Jura's efforts. He shouted her name and grabbed the abhorrent humanoid around the torn clothes and threw it off her. It had torn up her entire back into a bloody mess, revealing her protruding backbone. Jura attempted to turn her over and for a moment glimpsed her undamaged front. A stroke of immense pain flashed on her face. She bit her lips hard and shut her eyes. Her face would not move anymore hence. As heavy as it felt, he could not grieve, but had to stand and continue on her behalf. Quickly spotted another hunter being approached from both his back and front by beasts. His emotions poured themselves out into a scream as he ran towards the overwhelmed hunter, who saw him coming. As well did the monsters behind him. He rushed the beast in front of the hunter and sliced at its ribs, then retracted the stake. As he jumped out of its reach, he fired at its side, so it dodged towards the right. He caught it landing right where he had anticipated, and threw his entire body weight into a single, powerful thrust that had the stake shoot out loudly from the driver mechanism into the monstrous skull, audibly crushing it. He turned to see that the other hunter had achieved a similar success with the other prey. They looked at one another, both breathing heavy and loudly. He was shocked once he cast a glance over his back to where Kimberly's body should have been laying, but saw nothing there. No body, only the faint distinction of a small, bloody puddle that might just as well be the residue of a more abhorrent carcass. As the rage subsided, he soon discovered no bodies of hunters among the remains, yet detected fewer of them still standing. Come on then. Exhausted, he motioned to the man next to him, but was met with no response. The man was staring with mindless horror into the heap of human bodies that had served as the main feast for the wretched maws prior to their arrival. Jura stumbled over and grabbed at his shoulder, partially to support himself, but also to attract his attention. One of the gorged figures was still recognizable. He recalled the same face of a man that had stood with his family as they all gazed at the moon at the church. Now he lay in half, with the upper body still largely intact and untarnished by the fiends. His half-closed eyes stared up at the harrowed night sky. Jura wondered if he had known peace looking at said sky, or immense dread, and he proceeded to walk slower away, not with the same hurry to arrive at their determined destination. They moved silently through the corners and along the houses. Now a smaller party, they could utilize stealth to evade the senses of the rabid freaks of night. For around every corner did a new pair of glowing eyes lurk about. They move in and out of spaces between the buildings, keeping to alleys and avoiding the large streets. In the open areas, bodies lay like scattered dolls torn to shreds, acting as horrific lures to beasts that more often than not gorged on the remains. It all painted a terrifying course of events. Seeing how they were not scattered one by one, but gathered in crowds, it was more likely that the doom of many had been largely caused by confusing chaos. People going about their daily lives only to be set upon by ravenous maws that slew them quickly. It seemed the beasts were more attracted towards apparent movement, truly like a fiend with an unquenchable hatred and fury, rather than the hunting instincts of a predator. After some time had passed, bodies now reeking of putrid blood that surely smelled so sweet for beasts, like honey to the bear, they flocked to its source. Despite the disparity, they had not forgotten their true purpose besides the hunt. Every house they entered, they searched for life. But they always departed with their hearts plunged slightly deeper into the abyss. Though it was hard to have awareness of time, enough must have passed for the beasts to have grown restless with their piles of feasts, and had sniffed out those in hiding, as occasionally seen by a lone massacred body. They hurried past a long brick wall with a stone railing beside them, beneath which lay a descent further down to the valley hamlet. They came upon a small triangular yard where the single exit led out into the open street. An old wooden house stood before them, and Jura, followed by 3 others, climbed inside the window into the darkened house, while the rest of their team went to spy into the street. When they planted their feet on the creaky wooden floor, he instantly noticed the sound of something moving around on the floor above. By the looks of it, beasts had stormed the house and dragged out its inhabitants, judging by a wide streak of blood running out through the smashed door. But now something still lurked above him, and he was at this point more familiar with the behaviors of beasts than anything else. And this was no beast. He urged the others to remain silent and wait with a low gesture. He found his way up the staircase, right outside the kitchen he had entered into. It was hard to shift his balance along with the loud floorboards so as to minimize sounds. 2 doors were available, and he slowly opened the one to the left, to the room above the kitchen. Inside was a bedroom, and in a corner, behind a wardrobe, sat a figure. He took a step inside to reveal it to be a woman that had shut her eyes and held a child in her embrace, head turned to her chest. She had not yet noticed that it was in fact rescue and not despair that had come for her. "You can open your eyes. There are no beasts in sight," he announced slowly and with a slight tremble in his voice. Her eyes opened as if by a great shock, and she looked straight at him while tears immediately gushed out. He walked closer, and she relaxed her tense form. He first tried to reach for the child to better help her, but she insisted on remaining clung to her little life. He resorted to helping her stand by grabbing under her arms. She shakily stood while sniffling, uttering no word. "Come, we'll keep you safe." He led her downstairs to the entrance corridor, where a much larger group of hunters now awaited him. The face that turned to him was one he had prepared to never see again. Kimberly stood halfway through the entry door, along with the other hunters whose bodies had vanished upon their death. Kimberly!" he exclaimed, dumbfounded. "By what manner?" He interrupted himself when realizing that German's strange words in the dream had merit to them. Who can blame someone for not honestly believing it possible to cheat death? "It was just like waking up," Kimberly told. The pain of death was so frightening, and I did not, with all my being, want to depart. But I had no say. Her wavering and faintly traumatized expression added up to the fact that she truly faced death, and that by eldritch powers had simply been swept up as if in a dream. A sympathetic hand of one hunter who had shared in her fate laid onto her shoulder. She took a breath and regained herself. "But now I'm here, stronger than ever, and won't make the same mistake again. Honestly, the echoes of blood truly can strengthen." She glanced back at the others. "That makes our goal clear. We have the whole night ahead of us. For German, we can save old Yarnam." Though she was still shaken, her words breathed a renewed determination in every hunter. "Who's to say what's real anymore?" a hunter said. "But if we're stuck in a dream, and without the threat of death, we can only honor our master with a good hunt." Agreed. Jura sensed the return of his usual senses. Curse be any dream or reality. Wherever we are, we still know Yharnam, and we still know what's right. We'll continue to the church and get everyone out of here. There is nothing more to it. The staggering, and now confused, women were shuffled outside and surrounded by the hunters, holding tight to her boy. Keep your head as low as you can, miss, he informed. Our best odds of surviving is not to antagonize them. They have overwhelmed us at every turn. She gave a shivering nod, and they started their concealed march. They cut behind the houses that lay along the base of the cliff wall, atop which the rest of Yharnam's district was located. They managed to reach the large field outside the old church with no incidents. But the church was not in the same fashion as they thought it would. Only a scorched and smouldering frame of stone stood in its place. A heap of rubble lay in its doorway. Accompanied by the sight was a mysterious and worrying sound. A slow murmur that grew into a high-pitched, rustling call that faded into silence, then picked up shortly after. It was reminiscent of a wolf's howl, but not nearly as stable of tone. Noticeably, it was made by a broken voice that cracked, and every time it reached the peak of its cry, Jura desperately wanted to block his ears. The company approached to examine the remains of their former but brief sanctuary. Powder kegs must have torched it. But why ever? Jura walked up closer to the ruined heap of burnt wood in the doorway. Inside, he saw the still form of a lumbering body of a beast sitting in the empty hall. Unlike any beast he had ever seen, it was utterly and completely calm. Like a tamed hound, it sat with its back turned away from the doorway. Though burned by the flames, it was facing the statue of the three figures gazing upwards. From time to time, it emitted the irksome call. To Jura, influenced by the otherworldly sense, it sounded almost pitiful. He turned to his company and simply waved at them to turn around. Kenrick led his powder kegs and the remaining citizens onward with regretful spirit. Another group had split off from them with the rest of the civilians, heading to the same destination in a different route. As leader and figurehead, he had often been forced to quell such notions in favor for a larger benefit. Perhaps it was naivety that thought such hardship would become more durable. Perhaps it was only the show of a weak resolve. With the group of people that had remained at the church, they approached their new destination with speed instead of caution. There was no use in searching for additional survivors. None had ever been found. All that remained of them were either fleshy lumps or flesh-eating beasts. he could only hope to rescue what could be rescued from the workshop, then forsake the town to its fate. Be damned any codes or doctrines that dutiful hunters should abide. This was a new world in which they could only survive to live another day. The night had been long, longer than most it felt, and they had been forced into several stops due to trouble traversing the haunted town and increasing fatigue. On one occasion, they even managed to get some rest, but one that passed in the blink of an eye before being awoken by one of many terrible sounds. He motioned to his party to linger, and he alone stepped out into the moonlit street, illuminated still by the terrible red and violet glow. He stood motionless, to focus all his faculties on his hearing and awareness. All was eerily silent. He heard the smouldering and seething of a doorway that had caught on fire, but had since died out. Somewhere far away, a seemingly large beast roared in anger. A high and shrill scream that was far enough away as to not arouse concern. Small and unnatural steps could faintly be discerned. A bipedal humanoid, but not wholly human. The tapping of bare feet was irregular, and by the sound of it, there were at least 5 pairs to his estimation. He returned to the group, shaking his head and motioned for them to tour around the corner into the street's backyards. Had no ghoulish obstacles blocked their immediate path, they could have simply followed the street, taking a right up a hill to arrive at their sanctuary. Now, they were forced to navigate the narrow back streets and small yards with their foreboding dark corners, yet less probability of roaming fiends. Eventually they were forcibly merged onto the main street with little choice but to dart alongside its edge for the last remaining stretch. They slowly ran as fast as they could muster with the least amount of sound produced. The stumbling townspeople had Kenrick and every other hunter nervously alert to what may be attracted by the noise. After a few yards, they found reasons to turn back hastily. Up ahead, they saw a swarm of black death charging down at them. Wolven terrors sprinting like a ghastly wind and panting with heaving ferocity. If they turned back, they would only find more monsters to be caught in between. Trying to take shelter in the houses would only result in a crowded fight, having the hunters at another disadvantage. Staying together was the only maddening alternative. "Into the houses, all of you!" Kenrick shouted, and the hunters practically pushed the townsfolk into any open doorway that was accessible. "Fear not, hunters! Death comes for us all!" They spread out in the street, while some remained in a blockade formation, kneeling down and aiming their rifles towards the approaching terror. Bullets boomed out past Kenrick as they released a salvo of quicksilver. The stampede was not halted, only slightly distracted. The scattered hunters all leapt forward together and clashed with them. Blunt hammers, serrated blades and forge fire rained upon the beasts as they were forced to halt in their manic rush. They had been taken utterly by surprise, and all the fiends began to screech and roar as they flayed their claws and ran around aimlessly. To see beasts in a frenzy was the norm, but they must have been caught unaware to the degree it was now shock that caused their random behavior, for they retaliated poorly and seemed more occupied to make sense of directions. Suddenly he noticed, amidst the vortex of fang, claw and gunpowder, a new sound. A rumble of sorts. A distant cacophony that was not yet near enough to distinguish its qualities. When it did grow closer, he became so perplexed that he drew back to get a safe perspective of its approaching origin. Another stampede, but of boots and voices screaming in that of a furious battle cry. A group of people came running only moments after they had encountered the beasts. Torches and weapons raised like warriors of old came hunting after their prey. They clashed into the rear of the pack, and a horrible grinding sound surged by the impact. Blood and sparks flew as flesh was scattered and torn. Like a meat grinder, they had forced themselves into the beasts, and one could visibly see the effects of their fury on the spatter of guts and blood sent flying. The beast in front of Kenrick turned its head to look behind when it exploded by the impact of a thick round wheel of saw blades that came upon it like a speeding wheel. As the body was crushed under it into the street ground, a man bearing a constable outfit, not that of Yarnum's troop, and an iron cylinder on his head with a single black hole for sight, came charging at him. He redirected his massive armament at the realization of a man standing in front of him. Kenrick would have faced death due to the fact he was incapable of moving, a paralysis wrought by the sheer queerness of the savior. The man with the silly bucket-ass helm and the morbid armament let out a thrill-induced laughter that was akin to those of madmen. His voice was dark and sinister sounding, and the noticeable volume could alone send beasts fleeing in fright. He stopped, not to regard or pay any attention to him, but followed along in the motion of his swinging club that sought to find another fiendish victim, all the while continuing his hysterical cackle. By now, the imposing force that had pursued and swept over the beast became apparent to him. Some wore the usual constable attire. Others appeared like the everyday man, sporting articles much like that of the workshop hunters. Some even wielded things that would directly link them to the institution. With their numbers closing in with bloody fury and savage onslaught, the beasts continued their retreat and evaded past the powder kegs. The man that had stood face to face with Kenrick ceased his laughter, examining the group of hunters while his own company caught up with him. Then he broke away the long handle from the large, circular saw apparatus, which he slung on his back, and raised the handle, donned with a brass metal mace at the end to the air. He poured out a rallying cry, which was answered by his peers, and they set off after the fleeing rodents. Without a word or acknowledgement, they passed swiftly by and disappeared down the street, with the sound of their united voices fading. Awakening, if into or from a dream, Jura could no longer distinguish which. The pacifying glow of the blue lamp shined in his eyes. Next to him awakened Buddy, who had fallen in his peripherals just before himself did so. Unlike the merciful nature of common dreams, whose contents slowly faded away from one's thoughts, memories on this night had a much clearer continuity. His memory of his first death had sunk deep down into his mind where recollection could not reach, but having died time and time again, the incidents started becoming more lucid and detailed within his memories. This time, something had caught his and Buddy's ankle, which made them stumble and fall. Not seeing the two companions they had been with at the time, following them into the dream, he could only guess they had enacted vengeance upon their departure. He had recalled in a haze Buddy's neck being snapped by the jaws of the beast, and Jura had tried to reach for a blood vial. He had rolled away onto his back when another beast jumped atop him, pushing him down hard into the ground. A malformed crossing between man and wolf, with a broad grin on an ingrown muscle and a freakish mane similar to a lion's. Its eyes had been shining in sickly yellow, and claws started to maim his face. It took not long, fortunately enough, but while clinging to life, he felt every little motion tear deeper and deeper into his skull, slicing up the nose and tearing his eyes from their sockets. Horrible and outlandish pain that was unimaginable to any mortal who had the luxury of permanent death. But for him and his dreaming peers, it had grown dark and numb, until the blue glow appeared and he awakened as if from a dream somewhere else. What happened? Did I just die by tripping myself? Buddy asked, disturbed as he stood up, likely having little awareness from the moment he hit the ground. Broken neck, Jura replied shortly and detached, slumping down, having his vitality departed by his dreadful experience. His companion lingered for a moment, looking down at him. He just wanted to sit for a moment and try to make do with the fate he had been given, to decide if he could go out once more and risk having another living and memorable nightmarish death. Take your time, Jura. I'll head back out there. Don't take too long. Buddy left him there and made his way in the direction to where he had taken his last breaths, and hopefully where the others still were. Jura never considered immortality to be this cruel of a fate. There was little use in pondering on larger things, and their sheer unfathomness, due to the fear of existence, had often followed. But it had not made him mad just yet, and he put his hand to the lamp, and his vision blurred once more, just like falling asleep. He awakened on the stone-laid path up to the workshop in the misty and dreamy landscape. He looked around to find himself alone, with no one in sight. He walked up the little hill, but stopped at the doors of the workshop. A shining mask of a pale expression caught his eye, and he peered over the bushes to the other side, where the foot of the great tree was. The woman, the living doll, stood before it and looked up into the crown. He stepped through the garden and beyond the metal-barred gate that led into a large field of 1,000 white stargazer lilies. She stood like a statue, looking upward with her short cape of brown embroidered cloth, swinging slowly and serenely in a wind that was not felt. He approached her, only producing a sound from the grass and flowers that grazed his legs. When he stood right behind her, she gasped meekly and held her hands together at the convergence of her collarbones, if she even had any. I'm sorry, good hunter. I drifted away in my own thoughts. Do you need me? What were you thinking about? What do you mean? She cocked her head like a puppy. Your thoughts. You were drifting. What was it you thought about? She was silent, retaining an expression suggesting she genuinely had no idea of either the question's meaning or how to answer it. Well, it is strange that you would ask. I can't say what it was. Why can't you? I'm not sure. It is like I was not here for a moment. I have always been here. But my thoughts were of something other than here. You are not human, are you? Are you just a doll? He asked, despite the risk of offending her. But the question seemed more to her liking as her face relaxed more. Not in a wholly natural manner, but when considering her so far only having shown a perplexed expression or the usual dead face, it conveyed her mannerism somewhat. Oh, no. I am indeed a doll. How come? If you don't mind me asking. I have never seen a living doll before, let alone one with thoughts of its own. I don't know exactly. I think it was Gelmir that crafted me. Likely because he wanted a doll. Someone he could talk to and help him with his leg. I suppose that is sound. Though Gelmir does not strike me as one for dolls. The faintest motion played on her face. Had she not been so insistent on maintaining her uncannily still face, that seemed incapable of emotional display, he would not have noticed the ever so slight upturn in the corners of her mouth. I would agree, but I do love him nonetheless. You love him? That is a rather peculiar and intricate emotion. It is. but I would still say I do. I love you too, good hunter. It is what a doll ought to do. Rather than feeling flattered that a beautiful woman, despite admittedly being a doll, expressed her love for him, he felt a sort of remorse and a sympathy for her. She did not seem particularly sorry for herself, but he could not shake the melancholy and somber atmosphere that came sweeping over him when a doll told of its love for its creator. The visit back in the hunter's dream had left him with new inspiration and vitality to press on. But returning back to waking Yharnam, he longed more for a solitary hunt than the company of his fellows. Having seen death in many perspectives, he had begun to notice a seething anxiety each time he lay eyes upon one of the hunters, all of whom he considered friends. To see them die and return did things to his mind he was not admittedly equipped to comprehend. Perhaps it was the thoughts of the dream and everything tied to it that caused his being to boil with emotions too disturbing for him to handle. But what remained clear and felt like a waking reality was the notion of hunting and seeing that anyone who could be saved was saved. He toured the streets that now had grown more silent. He pondered that there probably only were beasts left in old Yharnam. Earlier, the air had been filled to the brim with sounds he could distinguish as the still human cries of terror as they faced a bloody demise below angry roars of beasts. Now, even the beasts seemed to have silenced themselves, likely due to the lack of prey. He approached a little walled plaza that had a single tiny tree in its middle. It was but a few yards on its sides, and seemed more like a house were planned to be built within the space, but never was. The sinister moon's red glare did not as potently influence the scene like it normally did, and just there he was reminded of the concept of reality. He noticed that in the corner of the little square, sitting against the reaching wall of a building, was a figure with a tattered cloth over itself. It was definitely a humanoid that had taken shelter from the ongoing nightmare, but appeared not to have endured this life. Motionless it sat, and he watchfully approached, curious of its peculiar form. He had thought the pose befitting a frightened human, but turned out to be a curled-up beast, retaining a largely humanoid body, save for it having grown hair all over, large hands with claws, and an overgrown wolf's head. It had still managed to keep its clothes on, albeit tattered and torn. The freakish merge of his own world and the beast's disgusted him, and the remorse previously felt vanished. But he noticed one little thing that had his sanity truly shaken, unlike any other of the night's impressions. not because the sight was outlandish and alien, but because the sight had him question everything he previously thought of the world that he was supposed to be so familiar with. Curled up in the lap of the beast, embraced by deadly claws meant for rending flesh, and wrapped in a tattered quilt, laid a figure that was about half the size of the larger beast. Although equally malformed and horrific as others of its transformed kin, it struck Dura that this was still a child, cradled in a mother's embrace. With his mind afloat in an eldritch dreamscape, Dura walked the darkened corners, finding no human life left to save. Having grown absorbed in himself, he moved like clockwork, functioning solely on the mechanism of his instincts and reflexes, his mind seemingly elsewhere. But his absent mind would return him to the present by a quite unique sound, distinguished clearly as the struggle of a hunter, judged by the light tapping of the leaping feet only a hunter could produce. Low grunts and strained breaths reactionary to a fight, but lacking was the snarl of beasts and wrathful roars. It could only be the clash of two hunters he heard. He lunged into a sprint, induced by curiosity and fear for a companion's life. Henrik returned to his thoughts after a long absence. On the road he emerged on, he saw two hunters. They paced around, the other waiting for the next to make a move. One was a powder keg hunter, who seemed more fatigued by the fight as he breathed heavily and hunched over in poor posture. The other was easily distinguished as the dreaded hunter of hunters, who in comparison was much more composed, with his breath controlled to the point of inaudibility.
"Hey, stop this! For God's sakes, men! Can you no longer tell man from beast?"
The beaked mask turned his way as he came running. The faint distraction prompted the powder keg to lunge at Fiachra in a particularly ferocious manner, low enough to be on all fours. But Fiachra was a sly hunter and likely figured his little show of distraction would cause such a reaction, and quickly disengaged to the side as his adversary swung a powerful uppercut with his saw spear, growling angrily as he did so. A single flash of silvery light pierced like a falling star across the hunter's side, which threw him off balance, but not toppling him. Fiachra made an elegant turn and came in close to the hunter's back, quickly and cleanly slicing his throat with both his blades. Blood gushed as the hunter stood abnormally still, trying to put his hand over his pouring wound. His legs gave out, but Fiachra caught him on his way down and put him gently to the cobblestone. Dura noticed how wrath had dominated the hunter's eyes and contorted his face in a raging mask of a man, only to be relaxed once his soul had fully passed.
What in the world?
Fiachra looked a moment longer at the departed hunter and started to trace his beaked mask upward towards the sky, lingering with his gaze upward. Then he looked on to Dura.
I can't blame you for not believing, but you must have heard.
But I saw him. Not long ago. He was with us. At the church, and he was...
Fiachra somberly shook his head, then closed the hunter's eyes.
It's a slow process. Some hide it well. What else can they do? They start removing their face cover just to get some satisfaction in the hunt. No one takes much note, but sooner or later it will be unbearable. I see it often. Had I known them like you do, I can't say for sure I would manage.
He pierced the body with his blade at the heart, then another across from it into the lung, then lastly into the stomach. His stabs were quick, obscured in their purpose. Then he looked up to the sky again, and muttered something low enough to go unheard, then stood up.
The night has been long, but I can't spare them their rights. Has the workshop given any words?
He wondered for a moment if he should mention the new, more surreal location of the workshop, but decided not to, mostly because he himself felt too tired to explain.
I can't say. Save the humans. Kill the beasts.
Fiachra looked back at the corpse.
Have you not heard anything?
He looked back and shook his head.
I have encountered some groups that struggle to hunt. I believe to recall having encountered the powder kegs departing for the old church.
They were not there. The group I was with did not meet them.
It is plausible they could make it back for the workshop. With luck, some might be there and a plan can be devised. Seeing how one is lacking.
Jura nodded begrudgingly, as he received a mixed form of relief and stress from partnering with someone that had just slain a friend. They departed towards their destination, both wordlessly walking along the shadowy facade of the bloody moonlight.
The process you mentioned. Why does it happen? I had known that man long, and you are now the only one that knew him in his last moment.
Fiachra hesitated for a moment, then drew for his breath.
'Tis a drunkenness. He ceased to be the man you once knew before I even met him. Perhaps it was best so. Like beasts they are, but never turning. Like I said before, I don't blame you for not believing, for it is a hard truth to face. Take my advice. Be wary of the deceptive love for blood.
The words of the master echoed through the hunter of hunters.
But why? Why is this hunt so deceptive, as you say? Why does a hunter have to fear to become like the prey?
There was nothing of eyes that he could see within the dark spots of the crow-like mask.
Why? Because the hunt gives you power. And power makes you drunk. And wishing for more.
Part of him hoped that his friend would come to the dream with the doll, never having to awaken to this nightmare again. But having been there himself, and knowing that his friend had become a wraith of the hunt, he was not wholly sure he wished him there. Kenrick ran as hard as he could, past the rubble in the streets, to where the carcasses of beasts still lay. He rapidly turned the corner and became still momentarily, then ran straight down a small dirt side street. When he merged back out onto a larger cobbled street, he saw down to the right the backs of his hunting party, ascending the slope to the workshop. He sprinted up to them, and those in the back turned their heads at his coming. Their drained and narrow-eyed expressions lit up at recognizing him. "No time to waste. Not home just yet." He continued forward. Each person he passed, hunter and civilian alike, started to quicken their pace, spending their last energy to reach sanctuary just a bit quicker. The exterior of the building was reinforced with unfamiliar fortifications. The windows had been hammered shut, and some cupboards and dressers had been tossed outside to form a barrier that protected the door. He was greeted at the door by the towering gratia that held it open for them as the civilians gained entry before the hunters. "Master Kenrick," she said in an outburst. "We started thinking you all lost to the night." They hurried inside, and the doors closed behind him, reinforced by a thick wooden log. Kenrick leaned over with his hands on his knees to catch his breath. "Not on this night." He turned his head up, not only seeing powder kegs, but plenty of surviving civilians, and in a greater number than what had initially been with them at the church. Some bustled about, having retained their courage, and now aided the hunters by seeing to the injured. Others lay floored on makeshift beddings, either because of injuries to the body or of the mind. A sorry sight, but heartwarming for Kenrick. "The town is lost. We were planning to depart. There is nothing left to save." "Are you certain, Kenrick? Out of all the living here, are these few supposed to be the last?" "It weighs heavy, but to find those few with their wits about is beyond anyone now." "But what about the beasts? Even if we leave and take these ones to safety, the threat remains, does it not?" He had entertained that very concept, but for his sanity's sake, put it aside for a time. Suddenly a man jolted up from the floor, folding himself in pain next to his watchful child. The sudden sound of the surge of ailment had him and others jump. He had sounded utterly surprised from a pain that must have struck him something fierce. His wife knelt beside to hold on to him. Even though Kenrick knew what was about to happen, he was surprised by the speed of events. It took 1 second for the groans to turn into a disturbing scream. Another second for the humanity in the voice to vanish, and in the next second, blood had sprayed from his back as it violently erupted. In the span of 2 more seconds, had his torso been pushed forward, ribcage erupted into a gross exaggeration, and the head transformed to a freakish muscle. Kenrick and some other hunters had all thrown themselves at the situation and grabbed the petrified woman just as the man's now freakish claws reached for her hungrily, wits of a man having now absconded. Kenrick kicked straight into the beast's face, while 2 hunters threw themselves over the woman and clumsily crawl-dragged themselves away, while Gratia had dexterously sprinted past and snatched up the child. The beast answered by roaring loudly and swiping wildly with its arms, tearing up deep wounds in both the woman and one hunter that was saving her. Kenrick was thrown by the monstrous strength, and the beast stood up, but in doing so became the target of 3 spears that began to thrust over and over from all directions, while Kenrick crawled backwards from it. The several piercing blades made it jerk around while blood sprayed from it, until there was only a standing body that crumpled down where it stood, seemingly having died and being held up by the spears that continued to penetrate it. The hunters had screamed while doing their work and now stood still, trembling from fear. Every other individual not equipped to face such a threat had made themselves small in the corners of the room, or simply left entirely. Still on the floor, Kenrick turned and looked at Gratia, who stood with the child in her arms, the small face held buried in her chest. He turned to the hunters, tired of this long night. The catatonic and devastated woman, along with the people, now appeared in a whole new light to him. He looked at them all with a new fear. A fear he, in some sense, always had known was there, but had never truly felt so grippingly. Like a cavernous maw closing over him entirely. Jura had started to feel a headache come on every time he saw the blue light of the spectral lanterns. While they did instill a calm and a sense of safety, they also reminded him of horrible deaths. Such memories had now been condensed into a headache instead of a full recollection. But for the first time during the night, the memories of death did not plague him as savagely, for he considered himself to have died quite nobly this time around. He and Fiachra had found 3 brothers that, like them, roamed the streets, hiding and trying to find an escape. They had deduced that the beasts had excellent smell and had to cover themselves in the reeking filth and gore of the carcass of the fiends. They had survived by cooperating until they encountered him and Fiachra. Shortly after their encounter, Fate had wickedly sent beasts on their trail, and Jura had, on sheer reflex and knowing of the dream, thrown himself in front of one of the boys as the ambushing beasts leapt over their prey. He had no time to wallow at the foot of the lantern, but could only hurry as fast as he could back to them, hoping he had bought Fiachra enough time. Slightly disoriented from the recent awakening, he set off, raw energy coursing through him and almost making him more dizzy from the stress. He did not run far, but it all the same felt like it was too long a journey. At the place of his demise, in the back alley of a poorhouse, he found Fiachra fending off one living beast out of 3, 2 of which lay dead. He paced in the small area so he always stood between the fiend and the 3 boys. Jura never stopped, but ran even faster, feeling the onset of adrenaline before a fight empower his speed. All heads, including the beasts, turned his way in shared surprise. The monster was unprepared and faced the might of the stake driver as it loudly shot out from the arm apparatus, sundering flesh and bone with ease. It reeled back by the tremendous force, and Jura twisted the stake deeper. It howled in pure agony. He pulled it out from the fleshy and mushy wound and cut it over the head. It fell down, silent and dead. The 3 brothers all stood in surprise, naturally conflicted about how to feel at being rescued by a ghost. Fiachra flipped the second blade into the former, not as fazed by his arrival.
Was hoping you would show up. Glad you remain pure to dream.
The group left the walled-off area to peer out in the streets. With a nod, Fiachra boldly decided to make a sprint down the open road, despite being wary for the wards they were accountable for. Further down was a large square, presumably one normally crowded by merchant stalls. Gaining in proximity to the open space, sounds made themselves discernible from the horrid ambience of old Yarnam. Beasts that otherwise melded with a constant rumble of freakish low and high pitch grew out of the perpetual nightmarish murmur to sound much nearer, approximate to the square. They slowed to a sneaking pace, but quickly hastened their steps once a group of humans could be made out further ahead. Circling them were the now bloodthirsty inhabitants of the town. More specifically, the ones they were encircling was a party of trembling townsfolk and guarding hunters. Seeing who was among the protectors caused him to lunge into a sprint with no regards for either his hunting companion or their wards.
Henrik!
Jura had never known himself as a man of faith or believer of miracles, but to find his friend in such an acceptable condition amidst such a nightmare was nothing short of divine intervention. In that moment, the relief and joy of seeing him overshadowed the fact that the reason for his own existence was likely considered more of a miracle. From where he had come, he had not yet stepped inside the square with which 2 other streets merged into, one to his right and one to his left. As he was running towards Henrik and the small crowd's aid, his footsteps were joined with the sound of a low rumble. From the left street entered suddenly a whole company of roaring men, brandishing weaponry only wielded by those craving the blood of beasts. Their timing could not have been more opportune, and they became the singular focal point to the fiends who had previously only the hunters as prey. A man resembling a constable of sorts noticeably led the charge of the hollering company, and with an overhead slam brought down a circular thick lump that crashed into a lesser beast. Adding to its macabre nature, the freakish wheel started to spin furiously, sending sparks and blood to the wind and turning the unfortunate monster to mush. Jura looked at Henrik, who had now spotted him. He appeared bloody, and his attire was torn in the edges, along with a perpetual hunched posture. With a nod towards him, he wildly motioned for his party to begin departing for the right street, now that the monsters had become preoccupied. Behind him, Fiachra and the lads had caught up with him, and they joined Henrik's party, heading down the second road, away from the massacre behind them. But they stopped in petrification from a single and thundering roar coming from further down. A low and reverberating sound in tremendously high volume. The sound appearing to Jura how it would sound when a whole mountain crumbled. The persistent sound turned into a sequence of equally loud utterings, then faded out, but having captivated the attention of all present. Even the fervous battle behind them appeared to have grown silently captivated. Throwing itself out from behind the buildings and crashing into the houses on the opposite side of the street came a towering and mongering 15 feet tall beast of such mass that it left a crater-like mark in the wall it had run into. It had retained a somewhat similar appearance of a man, but outlandishly muscular. Its legs were proportionally small, making it rely on the support of its humongous arms for the wild sprint. The impact with hard stone had it quickly changed direction, and now came crashing down towards them with its giant fists, leaving marks in the stone ground as it went. Henrik and his hunters had to push the petrified townsfolk out of the rampage as its body flew past. Once it encountered a clash of man and beast in the middle of the square, both sides leapt away from its massive rage. It stopped, having thrown down its open hand onto one of the fiends that was crushed into a bloody mess. It proceeded to wildly slam down its abnormal hands like a childish tantrum, made more freakish by the overall appearance. Its head was a massacre of a man's, with an oversized neck and the lower jaw possessing several protruding and long teeth. It ended the enraged display by standing up on its hind legs, reaching even further in height than it appeared, and let out another terrible roar. The company of warmongering hunters answered its battle call fearlessly and scattered around its hideous and colossal form. It was impressive to witness how adeptly they avoided the swinging arms of the frantic brute. The speed, despite its size, would have been unmatched, save for a hunter's agility. They had apparent trouble landing their attacks, however, as the fiend could leap great distances, only to leap back at them with the furious might of the bestial scourge. Jura turned back towards Henrik and shouted out, though he could barely hear his own words, that he and the others should stay with the civilians. Henrik's hesitation was enough as a reaction, and alongside Fiachra, he leapt into the fray. Each devastating fist hitting the ground sent tremors below their feet. It yelled a screechy roar that occasionally sounded like a loud gibbering before devolving into savage and furious throaty sounds, befitting only the most horrid beast. It moved nimbly along the horde of brave or foolish combatants that swarmed around it. Now and then would a body be thrown by the greater force of the beast's sizable hands, sporting nails long and sharp as swords. Jura soon discovered that attempting to land a strike was a precarious business. Paired with its nimble leaps and speed, it was incredibly frenzied in its outlashes and would strike wildly around and into the ground. However, despite appearances, it did not seem to be graced by infinite stamina, as it would occasionally appear briefly confused, as if not fully controlling its furious actions, and catching itself in momentary lucidity. Although it was plain that the sole emotion behind the small but piercingly glowing eyes was anger and bloodthirst. In between such a burst, Jura and Fiachra dodged closely around it, while the majority of the host of unknown hunters, who had likely also become aware of its pattern, congregated right before it, while others of their peers sprinted in and around its large frame like Jura had done. They quickly discovered that its skin was incredibly thick. While some of the others seemed to get some result, as judged by the splatter of blood, Jura and Fiachra produced lesser result with their rather shorter blades, and while dealing with such a potently fast opponent, Jura felt great hesitation to power up his stake driver into a thrust. The bucket-helmed constable often targeted the feet of the beast, and at times successfully shredded bits of its leg. Suddenly a lucky shot must have been fired and found its eyes, for it threw its hands up to cover its whole head while screaming in wrath. In the display of weakness, everyone excitedly rushed at their target with brandished weapons. It tumbled on its back and started to furiously slam its arms and twisting its body while on its back, again resembling the image of an overgrown and terrifying child. Two poor and eager hunters were sent into the air by flailing hands and limply cracked their bodies on the hard stone, never to stand back up. Jura had a strange and masochistic thought that he ought to be the one being so reckless, as he could indeed stand back up again. It regained balance and threw itself up, now heaving its chest with loud grunting breaths and looking around menacingly. Jura ran towards it, and the small head with yellow lightning orbs of ire tracked his movements while growling deeply, so the wide row of teeth exposed themselves. It jumped towards him with its arms ready to slam down into the ground. Jura threw himself out of the way and made a roll to regain his stance. Running after it came the constable, who thrusted his saw blade straight into the exposed ankle. Tendons visibly severed, and a large gap was left as the furry and leathery hide was finally breached. It slumped forward, supporting itself with its arms as it tried to stand, but failed. Fiachra ran around behind the constable and with elegant steps flew up, truly like a crow, and stood atop the hulking form. He hacked away at its upper back with his blades, like they were picks which caused great pain and desperation. Soon the giant's arms flailed upwards to grab or swipe off the little man, eventually managing to brush him off clumsily so he fell to the ground. As he turned to look to where the hunter had fallen, it was surprised by the freakish uppercut of the circle saw straight into its jaw. Now dazed and turning back to his direction, Jura took the chance and ran up to the gaping and roaring maw. The eyes was locked intently on him as he approached its now damaged form, only supported by one of its arms. Small dots of darkness with a predatory ball of glow, similar to that of cats in the dark, glared back at him. He thrusted his stake into the malformed eye with a single and easy motion. Part of his hand was plunged deep along the stake driver into its skull. The whole body jerked and became petrified. The other eye rolled back in its socket, and from the maw escaped a drawn-out, raspy groan. He pulled back his arm violently, causing a rain of blood, and its body violently convulsed so powerfully that it tumbled backwards and fell dead on its back. Blood-drenched and exhausted he remained, breathing heavy. The constable stood looking over to Fiachra, still on the ground in the process of climbing back to his feet. He searched for Hemwick and his group, but found only sight of the small crowd of civilians still cowering in fear, being covered by 3 other hunters who all had their faces aimed reluctantly at Hemwick. He sat a distance away from the group with his back turned, and approaching, he saw the cleaver rising up before cutting down into a body. As he was about to repeat the motion, Jura ran up and grabbed his arm, and the young hunter looked back wide-eyed at him.
Stop, stop! By the gods! Restrain yourself, boy.
He was horrified at the act, seeing a cowering but dead man lying curled in front of Hemwick. Fear overflowed within to the point it felt as if he could throw up, but it would slowly recede at seeing Hemwick's equally frightened eyes, not being that of a supposed blood-drunk hunter.
You saw him.
He stuttered, and the arm relaxed that he held so tight off. Inspecting the pitiful body, he saw the marks of an outward and overgrown jaw laying agape, as well as the long, thick strands of hair on its head that extended onto the arms. To Jura, even in the guise of a beast, the man looked very human still.
I had to protect them. He was done for. Or was he not? I can just come back. But them...
Jura gave no response, but released his grip. At first he thought he had acted on a fear for Hemwick's sake. Having become more acquainted with the Hunter of Hunters, he feared for a gruesome fate befalling his friend. Although this notion was not untrue, it was not the entire cause. For in his silence came the surprising realization that he more likely acted in compassion for a pitiless creature. He could not try and deny it, for he had known that hunters could, under circumstances, turn cruel.
You did right, lad.
Behind them approached a set of footsteps, and a constable with a bucket for a helmet, sporting only a single black dot for visibility, came into view. The deep and articulate voice spoke directly to Hemwick.
It was plain to see from the start. Ridden with vermin, the lot of them.
Jura faced him at a strange comment.
But you seem to have a knack for sensing them. And, most importantly, acting accordingly, young hunter. When this mess is sorted, why not consider joining the League and continue to hunt for those vermin?
Hemwick never changed his expression at a queer proposal. He never got the opportunity to answer it, though, for as soon as he had ended his sentence, the constable hunter turned and swung his giant saw-blade mace over his shoulder to return to his company. Cold blood dew. Droplet of cold blood containing blood echoes. Used to gain blood echoes. Hunters sustained by the dream gain strength from blood echoes. They imbibe the blood with thoughts of reverence, indeed gratitude, for their victims